All right, welcome back. You're still watching Wake Up Sierra Leone here on AYV channel 33, DSTV channel 399 and Radio 101.7 FM. Now in the second segment, in the studio we have been joined by the United States of America Ambassador to Sierra Leone, Brian Dividend, and he's here to talk about his visits to the provinces, MCC report, Tripartite Committee, U.S. support to the media in Sierra Leone, the civic space and exchange programs, among other things. Good morning and welcome, Ambassador.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me this morning.
Of course, as usual, it's a pleasure to have you here with us in the studio. And just as we know, this is your first time in Sierra Leone, but the second time here at Africa Young Voices television.
Yes, indeed.
And of course, you come with a great wealth of experience, having worked with 7 countries in 4 different continents. And now you're in Sierra Leone. How have you found Sierra Leone so far, and what has stood out for you?
Well, I find Sierra Leone to be a country that has tremendous promise. Promise economically, promise politically, promise socially. When I meet with the young people in particular here, you get very energized by their enthusiasm, by their engagement, by their desire to make things better in the country. There's a lot of work to be done, no question. There's a lot of work to be done in any country. But I take my cue from that energy that the young people here in Sierra Leone have, and by their spirit of really wanting to make a difference, wanting to make a change at the community level.
And your mandate is actually deepening the already existing ties between the United States of America and that of Sierra Leone as well. What key areas do you see as opportunities for strengthening these ties that we both have?
So Sierra Leone and the United States have a long and shared history. Part of that has been very positive. Part of that, of course, is a very tragic shared history of the slavery and the deportation of Africans to the United States and other parts of the New World. But I think where we go from here is going to be absolutely critical. And from the point of view of the United States, our primary interests here are in promoting what the Sierra Leonean people desire. Because we believe fundamentally what they desire, a stable, democratic, prosperous, healthy Sierra Leone, is what the United States would want to see for any of our friends or allies. So when we make investments, when I talk about the political situation, when I talk about the economic situation, it's in that vein of wanting to be a friend, of wanting to help Sierra Leone move forward, and fundamentally of wanting to help the Sierra Leonean people achieve the aspirations that they've set for themselves.
So you recently made visits to the provinces. What informed that visit?
So I had the opportunity to go to Kono. What I try to do is go to a different province every month, so that I can get a sense of what is going on outside of Freetown. I think a lot of us get caught in what I like to call the Western Peninsula area bubble. We see what's going on here. We get very involved in the politics and the back and forth and the debate.
Indeed.
When I go to the provinces, I get a very different look at what Sierra Leoneans care about. Because there it's much more about economic and social development and just the challenges of everyday life, of trying to live a rural agricultural economy, or in the case of Kono, trying to make that transition from what has been an artisanal mining district, where the diamonds, unfortunately, in the artisanal sense, are no longer as productive as they once were, towards more of an agricultural lifestyle, and trying to see how that transition is going, trying to understand the challenges that are there, trying to understand how development partners like the United States can contribute to that, and particularly in the Kono trip, looking at how non-governmental organizations can contribute to that, because we have a number of NGOs, civil society organizations from the United States that are putting their own money, not government money, but their own private money into Kono District, and a number of companies that are engaged in what we like to call corporate social responsibility projects. So Seawright Mining doing aquaculture, doing poultry raising with the communities, trying to really give back as they get ready to pursue a much broader mining project in the district.
Apart from Kono, where else did you visit?
So I've been to Bo, I've been to Pujon, I've been to McKinney, I've been to Port Loco, I've been to Cambia, and I've been to Kenema so far.
What challenges were you able to actually notify or to identify in your visit to the provinces?
So every district is different. I think we have to start with that basic premise. But I think if we're looking at commonalities, what I hear brought up over and over again by the communities that I visit are questions of employment, questions of water and sanitation, questions around access to health care, and questions around access to credit, the ability to be able to get the money they need to start businesses, to expand agricultural production, to buy the basic seeds and tools one needs in order to be productive in the agricultural sector. So those are some of the common challenges. And then, as I say, each district has its own. I mean, Kono, obviously, there's a huge focus on how we reclaim the former mining land to protect children who are drowning in these pits, very sadly, and very tragically. In a place like McKinney, there's a huge focus on how do we grow an urban economy? How do we deal with the challenges that the mayor was just addressing for Freetown, of waste collection, of cleaning the streets, of making sure that the markets are serviceable. So each one's a little bit different, but I think there are some common challenges that cut across.
Let's talk about the most anticipated. That's the MCC guidance. Sure. How far have we gone?
So we've gone a fair ways. So in December, the MCC board decided that Sierra Leone would remain potentially eligible for a compact. Based upon the progress that was made in the Tripartite Commission and the implementation of the Agreement for National Unity, the MCC recently invited a team from Sierra Leone to go to Washington to negotiate the terms of a potential compact. So that has now been concluded. The next step will be to take that before the MCC Board of Directors for approval. Okay. And MCC has been very clear to the government, and I've said publicly at other fora, that that will happen only after we see the final report from the Tripartite Commission. So we are waiting that. When that report comes out, then that will go before the board for approval. After that, we have to get permission from the United States Congress to be able to sign the final compact. And again, as I've said in other fora, that signature, that permission, is only likely to come once we see implementation of the recommendations that will come out of the Tripartite Committee, both on the legislative side and on the accountability side.
Is that a possibility that Sierra Leone might not get this grant?
I can think of many ways in which things could go off track. I mean, and I don't want to suggest I think any of these are likely scenarios, because I don't. Okay. But for example, Niger was in the midst of a compact negotiation when the military coup happened there. We had to stop the compact in Niger because of the military coup. Burkina Faso was in a similar situation. For MCC to go forward, one of the legislative requirements that Congress put down is there has to be continual progress towards democracy in the country where MCC is investing. So if there is retrograde in democratic progress, then we have to take a serious look at whether to move forward with the compacts.
And, okay, go ahead, please, go ahead.
Okay, so with this, you talked about making significant progress democratically. How critical is it that, you know, as a country, we actually build a culture of maybe transparency and fairness when it comes to democratic or electoral processes in all cadres or all levels in the country?
Essential, from my point of view. I see several intersecting issues in your question that should be addressed. First, we've got to get the baseline national and local elections that are run by the ECSL correct. Going all the way back to the very first multi-party elections here, there have been consistent issues. Many times the very same issues as you read the 2007, 12, 18, 23 reports from the observers. We need to see those issues addressed. I think, I have great confidence that the Tripartite Commission is going to get us where we need to be in a legislative sense, that they will look at those reports, they will take the recommendations seriously, and they will provide the Parliament, the President, and then through him the Parliament, a series of recommendations as to how to make the legislative and constitutional changes necessary to get the national local elections run through ECSL correct. Below that, I think we need to make sure that civil society organizations, that local interest groups, be that women's groups, be that youth groups, also have an internal culture of democracy. And I would add to that list the political parties. I think they need to have an internal culture of democracy. And we need to, I think, it behooves Sierra Leone and all Sierra Leoneans and all friends of Sierra Leone to really push to make sure that elections that are conducted within political parties, within civil society organizations, within other groupings of people meet basic democratic standards. And when they don't, I think it's important for Sierra Leoneans to speak out. And the reason I say that is because if we don't have that culture of civic engagement, if we don't have effective independent civil society organizations, we're never going to have an effective democracy in Sierra Leone. That's been shown time and time again in the literature and research. Coming out of the Bar Association elections recently, IGR, the local non-governmental organization that does research, published what I think is an excellent paper that talks about how dangerous the capture of civic institutions by political parties is, and how this hyper-partisanship that seems to infect all areas of life in Sierra Leone is really detrimental to the long-term growth of democracy. And they laid out, I think, some very good recommendations. Elections were certainly one of them, but I think also moving the parties to more of a focus on policy rather than on personality or on ethnicity. I think getting away from this victimization culture, you did this to me, therefore I'm going to do this to you, or I'm going to talk about grievances that happened 1, 2, 10, 20 years ago. That focus on past wrongs, I think, really has gotten to a point where it's creating an us versus them scenario, just in every segment of life, where one is defined as you either belong to this party or you belong to that party. If you belong to the party I don't belong to, therefore all of your ideas are bad and everything you do is evil. If you belong to the party that I do, then everything you do is perfectly fine, no matter what the justification. We've got to break that cycle if we really want to see Sierra Leone progress.
Being that you've been here in Sierra Leone, do you think we'll get to a point where we break that cycle?
I hope so. When we signed the Agreement for National Unity, the senior leadership of both the APC and the government made the right statements, and they identified some very concrete steps that could and should be taken to begin to break that cycle. Now, the Agreement for National Unity is not perfect, and it is not comprehensive, and there are many other things that need to be done at a base societal level. But I think that with the leadership saying we want to change the tenor here, we want to get to a point of national unity, and I think in theory they do. I take some degree of confidence in that. I think that needs to be matched by consistent action on both sides of the aisle. So I'm hopeful that as we move through the finalization of the tripartite process, as we see other parts of the ANU implemented, and as we look at how governance is going to be conducted between now and the next election, we'll see a seed change in how the parties interact with one another, and hopefully see greater, what we call bipartisanship in the United States, where the parties find common issues of interest to Sierra Leoneans on which they can work together across the aisle. I think everyone, when I talk to them, whether they're APC or SLPP, agrees we have an economic crisis in Sierra Leone that needs to be addressed. We have an inflation crisis in Sierra Leone that needs to be addressed. We have an energy crisis that needs to be addressed. We have a couche crisis that needs to be addressed. These aren't issues that should be partisan. These are issues in which both parties should be spending every ounce of their energy to try to fix for ordinary Sierra Leoneans.
After the elections, a lot of countries, including the US, did acknowledge that the elections were fought with a lot of irregularities. You know, just recently, as you've mentioned, we had the Sierra Leone Bar Association's elections. I mean, typically so, from what the IGR published, it appears as if there was a play of dirty politics, you understand, which perhaps distorted the electoral process, the Bar Association. And this is happening across the board, across all institutions, MDAs in this country. Toxic politicism is a problem. Now, as an expert, how do you think Sierra Leone can significantly depoliticize most of these bodies or departments and agencies which perform crucial functions to the country? How can we?
So I think it starts with good elections. I think it starts with good electoral management within the institutions that we're talking about. Obviously, these are private associations. They run their own elections. They run them independently. I would hope they run them in accordance with their constitution and their bylaws and the company law that exists in Sierra Leone. If they do that, we should remove a certain aspect of the partisanship from them. Secondly, I think it's important that the political parties make it clear that a bar election is not about APC or SLPP. A bar election is about who's going to manage an association that promotes the rule of law, promotes equal treatment before the law, promotes human rights in the most effective way. And that's not, you don't do it better because you're one party or the other. You do it better because of your personal characteristics, because of your experience. And I would hope that the parties would make it very clear, particularly if we want to avoid this partisan capture of civil society, that we're not participating here. This is a nonpartisan election. Sierra Leoneans vote for who you think is the best person to run the association, whether it's A or B. Secondly, I think we've got to work on basic civic education. And some of this goes to the media. We like in Sierra Leone to write stories about how this person is from the APC and represents this. This person is from the SLPP and represents this. And we like to set up every contest, whether it's for the Bar Association presidency or the presidency of the local agricultural cooperative. In some cases, I hear that, that this even goes down to church councils and mosque management committees as an APC versus SLPP contest. They're not, and they shouldn't be, and we shouldn't talk about them in that way. We should be talking about the issues that are relevant to that association. But frankly, there isn't an APC way to do rule of law and an SLPP way to do rule of law. There is rule of law. So I think we've got to change how we talk about it. And I think Sierra Leoneans need to change the way that they identify themselves. So many Sierra Leoneans see themselves as either APC or SLPP. We're all so much more than that. Our party identity, sure, for a lot of people is very important. For me, it's not. I'm a career civil servant. I don't identify with either political party in my country. But I know for a lot of people, party identity is important. But so is so much else of what makes up your character. And I think Sierra Leoneans need to define themselves and others as more than SLPP or APC. And then my final thought on this, I hear oftentimes, and I think this is where it really gets dangerous. I have heard very well-educated, otherwise very sophisticated Sierra Leoneans say to me, hey, he betrayed his tribe. He's from the north, he should be APC. Or she's from the south, she should be SLPP. She can't advance because she's associated with the other party, and that betrays her region, or that betrays her ethnicity, or that betrays her tribe. And that's dangerous. That sort of speech we need to all take out of our lexicon. Anyone has the right to associate with whatever political party they want, and they should not be talked about as having betrayed their tribe because they happen to have a different political philosophy than other people who come from that ethnic background.
Let's now talk about the media in Sierra Leone. Are you interested in the media?
Absolutely. I think the media plays a critical role. I mean, you all are the ones who inform and educate most of the populace here. You define the issues that we're talking about, particularly in Freetown. You define the way in which we talk about those issues. and you have a platform through which you can choose to put out helpful information, or you can choose to put out partisanship. So what the media does, I think, is critical to this overall question.
The media, in Sierra Leone is largely, I might say, especially with the emergence of the new media, is unregulated. And for example, you have a lot of blogs who would just, and the media is slowly moving away from the traditional to now accommodate all these movements in recent technologies. How do we as well also, because you mentioned something very critical for the media, how we could actually take out some hate speeches or whatever words from a lexicon when it comes to that. How do we move forward with having that regulated and having the right messages across?
So it's self-discipline. I believe firmly in a free press and a free media, and I applaud the government for changing the media environment here and really opening it up. That's a good thing. New technology is a good thing. Fundamentally, having more voices that we can be exposed to, more points of view, more things to consider, this is all very positive. But as my grandmother used to say, and I've used this phrase before, just because you can say it doesn't mean you should say it. I think people who want to engage in media space, whether that's traditional or whether that's social, have to ask themselves, is what I'm putting out there going to be valuable? Is this actually news, or is this just salacious gossip and insult? And if it falls into the category of salacious gossip and insult, maybe you ought to not say it. Maybe you ought to not give it the publicity that it might not otherwise have. And maybe you ought to focus on the news that actually matters to Sierra Leoneans. And that doesn't mean you should say the government is wonderful, the government is perfect, the government does nothing wrong. You absolutely should look at what the government's doing and take a hard look at it. And there are some things the government will do right, and there are some things the government will do wrong, and I would hope media would report accurately and factually on both and put out the different points of view as to whether a policy is good, bad, or indifferent. I think where it crosses into dangerous territory is when a social media blogger or a media house decides it doesn't matter what the government does, everything they do is wrong because I'm affiliated with the other party that doesn't control it, therefore I'm just going to trash everything they do. That's not right. Similarly, it's not right when people feel, well, it's my government, therefore I voted for them, therefore I'm not going to criticize them. Of course you should criticize them if you disagree with what they're doing. I was reading before I came on an article in the midst of a U.S. election by an African American who clearly will be supporting Joe Biden in November, saying President Biden has not done enough to deal with entrenched problems of the African American community in the economic sense, and being very critical of a government that I know this person has supported and probably will vote for in November. It's okay to hold your own government to account. In fact, in some ways, it's even more important when it's your party in government to hold them to account.
The civic space is, crucial for democracy. What would be your assessment of that space here in Sierra Leone currently?
So I think what we have right now is a legislative environment that allows for civil society organizations to exist and function. My concern is not so much about government regulation at the moment. My concern is more about partisan capture and the idea that every civil society organization is either linked to this party or linked to that party. And we have to therefore capture and make sure that every civil society organization is linked to our party and says good things about us. And that's not the role of civil society. Civil society is supposed to either be delivering services at the local level to communities, which is a very important function, and in doing that they should do it in a completely nonpartisan way, or they should be advocating for issues, like the Bar Association advocating for equal treatment under the law, like any number of organizations that are advocating against human trafficking, like the organizations that have been set up recently that are advocating against Kush and trying to help the victims of Kush. These are not organizations that should be partisan in their nature. They should be working around the issue that they have set themselves up to advocate for. And I think we've got to move away from this idea that I have to agree with everything that the political party that I affiliate with says. And I think until we can get to a point where civil society organizations can be equally critical of both political parties, sometimes at the same time, we're not going to really hit that point where we have the free, vibrant civic space that you're talking about.
2 years ago, I was chosen for an investigative journalism fellowship in Ghana, which was partly sponsored by the U.S. Embassy in Ghana with the Media Foundation for West Africa. Now, the Fourth Estate in Ghana is doing a phenomenal work when it comes to investigative journalism, which is something I have a very huge passion for. I hope it could be replicated in Sierra Leone. Now, but just to perhaps support what you had said earlier and ask a question on top of that. Now, we've seen a rise in salacious gossip in Sierra Leone, sensationalism and yellow journalism all over the place. Now, but a major critical factor, I think, for that is responsible for that is low funding or low budget. Now, the media in Sierra Leone is no secret, it's poor, more or less. You understand? There is no money to undertake accountable or accountability journalism. Yeah. So the question would be, from me to you, or to the embassy generally, is do you think that the U.S. Embassy can start funding independent and robust, deep-seated investigative journalism in Sierra Leone, like a trust fund for investigative work in the country?
I know Slodge and some others have this idea of setting up a media trust fund, and I'm very much supportive of that idea. I think it's a very important way to look at how we sustain media over the long term. As an international donor, we have to be very careful about how we use our dollars to make sure that we're not influencing the domestic political trajectory of Sierra Leone. So I think for us, our role as international donors, yes, we'll certainly look at the trust fund as that gets established, because that is to be run on a nonpartisan, transparent basis, which is why I think it's such an excellent idea that they've put forward. But I think for us, where we can really add value is in the training of the journalists who are going to be engaged in that work. Because as you know, investigative journalism is not something you just walk into and start practicing. It requires training, it requires ongoing skills development, it requires ongoing skills refreshment. So I think as international donors, we can certainly continue to work in that space. And I think we should all look at the idea of the trust fund and what we might be able to do there. I understand a lot of the focus is on getting private foundation money, which I actually think is a good thing, because then no one accuses the managers of that trust fund of being beholden to an international power. But I think there's definitely space for that. The other thing I'll say is media is fundamentally a business. Media houses have to look at their bottom line in the same way as any other business. There is a proliferation of media houses here in Sierra Leone that run the gamut from the very large, like AYV, that probably is moving towards self-sustainability, to the very tiny, which will probably never be self-sustaining. And I think people need to seriously look at whether their media house can be a successful business, whether they need to look at mergers, whether they need to look at acquisitions, whether they need, I think it's now up to 500 print dailies being published in a country of 8 million people. So I think, as I've said to some of your colleagues in Slodge and elsewhere, I really do think that part of the challenge here is that media has not been treated so much as a business. It's been treated as a prestige thing. I am an important politician or an important businessman, therefore I set up a paper to publish what I would like to be published. Okay, if it's a prestige thing, that's fine, I guess, but that's not going to yield investigative journalism. It's not going to yield self-sustainability within the media space. And I really do think that as we get to some of the larger media houses like AYV, I think that model is probably a better one for Sierra Leone. A few smaller, larger media houses that can sustain themselves rather than 500 independent print journalists who I don't know where the devil you're going to find the advertising revenue.
So in essence, you're saying that media houses should be creating mergers, like conglomerates, more or less, coming together and forming a very strong,
I think there is definitely space for that in this market.
Okay.
Obviously, that's a question for the media houses themselves to talk about, and I know there are 1,000 factors as to whether you merge or not. But what I will say is I think it's clear that the volume of potential advertising revenue right now cannot sustain the number of publications and broadcast houses that we have in Sierra Leone.
Indeed.
And that's a problem.
Exactly. So let's also talk about some of the exchange programs, that the U.S. offers to Sierra Leone. And Jones was asking earlier when it comes to investigative journalism, but with other areas or themes, what are some of the initiatives or programs that are out there?
So on the exchange side, we have programs that range from high school exchanges, where high school students are able to go and spend a semester in the United States, all the way up to professional programs like the Fulbright Scholarship for people who want to go get doctorates in any number of fields. So there's a full range of opportunities. I think the signature one, of course, is the Washington Mandela Fellows Program, which focuses on civic activism, governance, and economic development, and invites people to apply for opportunities to go and do a very intensive leadership training program in the United States, including an internship with a U.S. Entity to really give them hands-on experience in their field. And that's really our signature, I think our most impactful of all of these, because it really does develop a cadre of leaders over time who have that broader exposure to the international system and those contacts that they can draw on over time to really make change here in Sierra Leone. We also do a lot of shorter things, the International Visitor Leadership Program, where people go for a few weeks, generally with folks from other parts of Africa in specific areas. There's, of course, our specialized programs in journalism and women's economic empowerment, in STEM, that we send folks on, and then the Fulbright program, which, of course, is the most academic of what we do, where we actually pay for people to go get masters or PhDs in a field that we've identified as deficient in Sierra Leone.
How many candidates do you select in a yearly basis?
So it varies depending upon the budget that Congress decides to allocate in any given year. We work on yearly cycles, but normally we send between 10 and 15 on the Washington Mandela Fellows Program. We'll send a similar number on the International Visitor Leadership Program. The specialized programs, we probably have 2 or 3 people going on 4 or 5 of those every year. The YES program is about 20, that's the high school exchange program, is about 25 students that get to go annually from Sierra Leone. And then Fulbright, because it is by far the most expensive, normally, and there aren't country allocations for Fulbright. So Sierra Leoneans are competing against people from around the globe who want to get that scholarship. It's normally 3 or 4 that we're able to fund.
Okay.
You're watching Wake Up Sierra Leone on the Africa Young Voices television, and I am Victor Jones. I'm here with
Elizabeth Momo.
Indeed. Let's now go for some Facebook messages and see what people have been saying. Elizabeth, would you care to start?
Yes, so from our Facebook page, For the Bundu says, if the West countries want to help Africa, manufacturing and industrialization is one of the best ways, rather than giving money aid to African governments that end up in the hands of politicians.
For the Bundu says, USA ambassador in Sierra Leone knows the issues than most people in Sierra Leone. We look at everything these days on party, tribal and regional politics. That is very dangerous and breeding hateful thoughts about others with different opinions or belief from ours.
Paul Kanu says, state capture of the civil space and media, simple and straightforward.
Apart from advertising revenue, people cannot afford to buy newspapers. They focus on praise singing or slander to generate income pending the target interest. Victor Ako Mengot says that.
Okay, I think that's all from my side. I can't seem to get through the messages.
The last one I'll read is Dawda Tawali. Until we start condemning our political parties, whether in opposition or in power, when they are not doing what is right, we will forever remain divided.
Okay, so this is some of the comments from our Facebook page as we try to wrap up the conversation here this morning. Do you have any message you want to respond to?
Well, I'd say some of those are very insightful thoughts. On the industrialization question, I think it's absolutely critical that we do more to attract private sector investment in Africa. What the United States does, and I think several other developed countries do this as well, is we have what's called a Development Finance Corporation, which provides equity stake, provides capital financing, and provides private insurance for companies that want to invest in developing countries. Sierra Leone's made excellent use of that. You are right now, or as of September, you were the 4th largest recipient of DFC financing in Africa, and that goes directly to the private sector. So it's for things like the Western Power Project that we'll break ground on very shortly. It's for the expansion of your digital network through AfriCell. It's for the construction of the new airport out at Lungi. So there are these opportunities for the private sector to be able to get funding as well. I don't think we can neglect the social sectors, and I don't think we can neglect some of the very important work that our development agencies do at the community level in favor of putting more into private sector. I think they have to move in tandem because we have to deal with the here and now realities of people's lives while we build the longer-term, stronger economy. But I think the commenter is absolutely right that we can't ignore industrialization and private sector development. I also agree that we have to be very careful that every dollar that is spent by development partners is reaching its intended target. We have too little development financing coming into Sierra Leone for any of it to be misused in any way. And that's a shared responsibility between donors, between the government, and between the stakeholders who are the ultimate beneficiaries. So we need everyone's partnership to make sure that there's no corruption whatsoever in development programming. On the question of sales of newspapers, I will tell you in the United States, sales of newspaper is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the overall revenue of any paper. That is not how papers finance themselves in most of the world. In the vast majority of the world, including the developing world, most papers operate on advertising revenue because sales of papers are never going to generate what you need to run it as a business. So I think it's very important for media houses to look at how they can generate sales, sure, but more importantly, it's about attracting advertisers, which means having people who are reading, whether they're reading that paper online, whether they're reading that paper paying for it, whether they're not paying for it, they're just picking it up in the village hall. Advertisers care about eyes on the product. And that's really where media needs to focus as to how do we get more people looking at the product that we're getting out there. I know that people believe salacious gossip sells. When you look at any studies that have actually been done on media markets in Africa or anywhere else in the world, there is no difference in readership between those who publish nonsense and those who publish hard facts. In fact, if anything, trusted media sources are something people are hungry for in this day and age. So I would argue that publishing the truth and making sure you get it right each time, every time, actually will get you a greater readership than just publishing nonsense or salacious gossip.
Just before we go, Ambassador, just something I would like you to clarify. There has been this huge cloud of misinformation around the work of the Tripartite Committee, which had been set up. A lot of people seem to believe that the committee's recommendation will inform a rerun of the previous election. Just a clarification before we go.
So the committee's recommendations are supposed to fall into two baskets. One, reform of the legislation that governs your elections, and two, accountability for those who may have engaged in wrongdoing during the 2023 contest. Those are the two things that we expect the committee will come out with. I will say, as I've said before, I think it's critical, particularly in an environment like Sierra Leone's, that whatever the committee comes out with in terms of recommendations are consistent with the rule of law. We can't use the argument, well, they violated the law, so we're going to violate the law. That's not good for democracy. It's not good for institutions. So it's going to be absolutely critical that the committee's recommendations are in line with Sierra Leone's electoral laws. So my expectation is that we're going to see recommendations about how we set up the tribunals to look into behavior of certain civil servants and others, and I expect we're going to see a legislative and constitutional package coming out of there.
All right, so thank you very much for making time out. But before you go, I want you to take your time to speak to the people of Sierra Leone.
Oh, well, thank you. So to the people of Sierra Leone, I would simply say you have so much potential here in this country. You have the ability to create the economy, the social sector that all of you keep telling me you want to have, one that can support the 8 million people who live in this country. If we're going to get there, it's going to require 100% of the population working together. These challenges are too big for any single party to solve on their own. And this is why it's critical that we see progress towards national unity, progress towards democracy, and a coming together of the Sierra Leonean people to drive this country forward.
Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure having you. He's Brian David Hunt, Ambassador of the U.S. to Sierra Leone. Well, this is perhaps where we will fold up our wheels for today and go back soon to re-energize for tomorrow. It's been quite an enlightening discussion here this morning. Yeah. And I want to thank you very much indeed for taking your time to watch the program right from its beginning onto its end. My name is Victor Jones.
And I am Elizabeth Momor. Many thanks to our sponsors and for you for taking time out to be with us, as Victor has said. Continue to stay with AYV throughout the day as we have all the exciting programs coming up. Till we meet tomorrow for another interesting edition of Wake Up Sierra Leone, I say bye-bye, take care of yourself.